Welcome to the ReGen Brands podcast. This is a place for consumers, operators, and investors to learn about the consumer brands supporting regenerative agriculture and how they're changing the world. This is your host, Kyle, joined by my co-host, AC, who's going to take us into the episode.
On this episode, we have Ash Glover-Ganapathiraju, who is the founder and CEO at Ojaswe. Ojaswe is supporting regenerative agriculture with their lineup of pantry staple items like pancake and muffin mix made with regeneratively grown chickpeas. In this episode, we learn about how Ojaswe's product mix is truly farmer first and regeneratively inspired. Ash shares how being a queer, BIPOC, and immigrant founder has shaped her journey, her brand, and her products. Plus, we dive deep into the most urgent issue facing the immediate and long-term future of regenerative brands. Damn, that's a good cliffhanger right there. Let's go. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the ReGen Brands podcast. Super fired up today to have our friend Ash from Ojaswe with us. So welcome, Ash.
Thanks, AC. I'm so excited to be here with you and Kyle. Huge fan of the podcast, and I'm very, very glad to be talking ReGen Brands with you.
We love talking ReGen Brands, which shouldn't surprise anybody because we literally have a podcast called ReGen Brands. We're super stoked to have you here. I'm going to go ahead and call it out. We tried doing this episode yesterday, and because we had some technical difficulties, this is take two, and this is the first time we've ever had a take two officially like this. So it could mean we're going to have like the best, most buttoned up interview ever, or we're going to be like way off track, trying not to make the same jokes we made yesterday. So I already know that's going to happen. So we'll just have to see how this plays out. But Ash, we are super stoked to have you on, which feels like the second time, to talk about Ojaswe and your story and the efforts you're making in the regenerative space and the challenges of being a super new regen startup. You come from a place of a lot of different expertise and a lot of experience in CPG, but this is your first time as a brand, your own brand, pushing this thing forward. So we're excited to have that conversation. So for those who are unfamiliar with Ojaswe, give us a quick lay of the land. What sort of products are you making? What flavors do you have? Where can people find your products today?
Yeah, I'll start with the easiest. You can find all of our products on www.ojaswe.com. That's OJASWE.com. What we make at Ojaswe is Indian-inspired or South Asian-inspired regenerative pantry items. Our first line is a line of savory pancake mixes with chickpeas and South Asian spices in them.
Love that. We were just talking about lunch before we hit record, and now I'm wishing we would have had this for lunch.
It's a fantastic lunch.
It feels like it would be a fantastic lunch, right? Some savory pancake in the afternoon. Now, I think you also have one additional product line outside of the pancakes. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. We just launched it's on pre-order right now, but it's a masala muffin mix. So it's a muffin mix with a South Asian-ish twist, which is kind of our shtick. It's also chickpea flour based, and we make our own flour. And it's got South Asian spices, and you can do whatever you want with it. It's vegan and gluten-free, and our goal with that is to make it as inclusive as possible to the largest number of folks as possible.
Love that. I've never had a savory muffin before, and I'm excited to try my first one. As a huge chicken tikka masala fan and muffin fan, this sounds like a win-win partnership for me.
Yes. So muffins are confusing to me because they just feel like mini cupcakes. This just feels like an excuse to eat more cupcakes, which, yes, everyone should eat more cupcakes. Masala muffins are just a baking version of our pancake mix, honestly.
I actually had a heated debate about the difference between muffins and cupcakes at a party once. And really, it's hard to define. One has more of like because they're both sweet. They're the same shape. Like, is it the heartiness? Is it the fact that it's supposed to be breakfast and not dessert? You don't put a candle in one. I don't know what the difference is.
You don't put icing on one and just call it a muffin in the morning. Yeah. I don't know.
Ash, are the products just add water, or do you have to add other ingredients to the mix?
They are just add water.
Nice.
If you would like, and the most traditional way of eating a chila. So a chila is there are other cultures in the world that have some version of it. A chila is typically made with chickpea flour, really fine chickpea flour. And you would add vegetables to it just to make it more hearty. The most traditional way that I've grown up with it is to add tomatoes and cilantro to it. But
Mm.
I live in North America now. I've lived here. This is home. And tomatoes are not all round season. They don't taste really good in the winter, for instance. I've done canned tomatoes, or I've done things like zucchini, bitters, bitter greens, arugula, things like that in the mix too, and it totally works. But they're
Interesting.
just add water, I see.
Yeah. Well, having the pleasure of knowing you outside of this podcast interview, the product line is really interesting to me because it's kind of the perfect culmination of your personal story, or like it's just very evident, right, how these things came to be once you know that background. So give the audience the feel for just your story and how you kind of went from your previous background to MBA to CPG to founding your own brand.
Yeah, I'll keep this as short as possible, but I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. I did not think I would ever have my own company, let alone my own CPG brand. I was born and raised in the south of India. I've spent most of my adult life here in the US, mostly in Arkansas, a short stint in Indiana, and I now live in Seattle. So for
I
me,
want to pause real
moving
quick. And
from
you
Yeah,
went from
yeah,
living the
Arkansas and
majority of your
Indiana
life
from India. That's
right.
that's a stark
You went from
contrast.
no experience in the United States from India. What time did you leave India? What time in your life?
uh, very early 20s.
Okay, so early 20s, and the first U.S. experience you have is Arkansas.
Arkansas.
Like, tell us
That's right.
about some of
That's
that
right.
culture shock.
Oh gosh, that was a long time ago now. Um, I am, well, I just turned 40. So I've spent exactly half my life, I think, here. Well, almost half my life here and
Yeah,
almost half my
we'll
life
round up.
elsewhere. Definitely going to round up. Thank you. I am, I think for me, moving to Bentonville was a little bit of a culture shock. Because at the time I thought I was going to be visiting for a couple months. I had family there at the time, and the only thing I could find about Bentonville online was on a MySpace page, and it was, a picture of the town square. This is definitely gonna date me, but
Yeah.
I
it
have to pause and make
was
the
I
same
was
joke I made yesterday because I still need to know who was on Bentonville's top 8 MySpace page.
I still don't
Back,
know the
circa
answer to
10
that.
years ago. We need to know. Somebody's got to dig that up.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And
If someone does dig it up, I'd love to hear what the
I
was
need to
wrong.
know what the profile song was and if it was Party Like a Rock Star like my last MySpace song was in like 7th grade.
Oh my God. I have no idea. That's probably for the best.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Hmm.
think for me though, the big culture shock was not so much moving from a city of 13 million people to a city that had, I don't know, population 4,000, 40,000, 15,000. I don't even remember
Mm,
anymore.
mm,
Um, it was food, right? I was coming
Mm.
from one food culture to a completely
mm,
different food culture.
mm,
And what ended up happening is, I think, a little bit of what you see with Ojaswe products too. I started to be, and this is not an uncommon immigrant story, right? You take the ingredients around you and you sort of make the recipes you're familiar with using the ingredients that you have access to. And that's kind of
mm,
how my food evolved over time. So
mm,
my now wife's food is also my food because I love
mm,
being in the kitchen. I love preparing food. I love learning new recipes. My food sort of took a little flavor of Arkansas. It took a little flavor of Indiana, a little flavor of Western India, where, I have family who taught me how to cook there.
mhm,
And it's sort of what you're going to see in Ojaswe's products as well. So, which is why I hesitate to classify them as truly Indian products. I think
mm,
that's
Mm.
kind of misleading. It's
mm,
definitely Indian-aid.
mhm.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think it speaks to the level of authenticity and intention you have in the brand, right?
Mhm.
You want
Yeah.
it to be accessible to many, like you mentioned earlier, with a level of authenticity like this is truly like I think you yesterday called it like a Southeastern
South
Asian,
South Asian.
Asian-ish. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
right?
definitely South Asian-ish. Yep.
Mhm.
Right. So you get to Bentonville.
Yeah.
You're going to school. I think you start with the MBA program there, and then I think you had plans to be a doctor. How did that all happen? And then how did you end up in CPG
Yeah.
from there?
Oh, good question. So I actually started on an MA and I finished an MA in comparative literature and cultural studies.
Mm,
As I was saying before, cultural anthropology is really where
mhm,
where my career in academia comes from. And it really is about people, right? And understanding people and the behavior, our behavior and how it shapes the cultural brand us.
Mm.
And I thought I wanted to go be an academic because nobody loves a good book and research like I do. Once I started down that path, though, I realized really quickly that what I wanted to do was take all of these skills around understanding human behavior and put them into practice in a way that made more everyday and lived experience sense to
Mm.
me.
Mm.
It also coincided with some personal stuff that I had going on. I was about to have a baby, so I moved back to Arkansas and decided to, like I said, I had family there at the time. It just made sense for my personal logistics, and I ended up meeting a few people who had gone through the MBA program and went through the MBA program there. Arkansas back in the day, it tended to be a very, very CPG focused school. I mean, JV Hunt is there, Walmart's there, Tyson's headquartered in Northwest Arkansas. So much logistical and supply chain
Mm.
expertise and experience
Mm.
exists in that area. That you kind
Right.
of sort of just get funneled into CPG once you, or at least
Yeah.
that used to be the case when I when I graduated with an
Yeah.
MBA from the University of Arkansas. And that's how I landed up in CPG. I did my internship with Unilever. I worked for a small CPG company before moving to Starbucks. Um, I was really drawn to Starbucks' human-centered value system in the way that they spoke about the company and the mission of the company. Um, it's what brought me out to Seattle, and then through the acquisition, through the partnership with Nestle, I ended my CPG career in 21. I wouldn't say ended. I'm somehow find myself back in CPG again, but with big
Right.
CPG in 21, right at the
Mm.
right as we were coming out of the sort of supply chain crisis with the pandemic, I decided to sort of take a pause and pivot my career and think about, kind of what else is out there that aligns with my values, that
Mm.
aligns with me wanting to work on the food system in a more direct way.
Mm. And that was around the time that we had our first conversation.
That's
And
right. That's right.
I want to just give the audience the background that when you took that time away, CPG was not the first thing on your mind. You and I actually talked about a couple other ideas. They were all around climate and they were all around regenerative agriculture. But would love to just hear you kind of touch on that journey and why you came back to CPG. Because I know you did a lot of conversation and research, and the customer feedback is really what led you back to this space.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And you're right, AC. I think we spoke just as you had started at RFSI maybe, and I
Uh,
had
yeah,
I don't know, like time is so
something
weird
around there.
post-pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I didn't start out, you're right. I didn't start out saying, "Oh, I want to go found my own CPG brand." I think for me, it was much more, I want to go work in sustainable or climate change related work. But I didn't know exactly what that was. And
Mm-hmm.
historically, I've had several opportunities in my career to be in sustainability roles, but every single time I found myself backing away or turning them down, just
Mm-hmm.
because in a lot of cases, sustainability is sort of an auxiliary function. It's a thing that
Mm.
happens not core to the business. And that's not to
Check the
say,
box.
yeah, very much
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
Nice to have, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
which really also means that's not where the money is being generated. It's seen as a resource drain, and when things are getting cut, that's the first thing to go.
Yep.
Um,
Hmm.
for me, that's not how I wanted to work in sustainability. And I knew that. And I think in retrospect, I can say, yep, that's what pushed me away from sustainability careers as a whole. I think for me, once I quit and started going down this path of what exists in climate, I ended up, one thing led to another, honestly, and I ended up doing climate farm school with Terra.do. Huge shout out to Terra.do.
Mm. Mm.
Climate Farm School changed the way I felt about our food system and kind of drew me back to this area of food. Food has been an area of personal interest. We talked about it just before hopping on. Um, Food is kind of how it's culturally embedded in me. I'm very much a
Yeah.
South Asian mom in that I want to ask everyone, "Oh, what did you eat for lunch today?" And it's a way of me saying, expressing interest, right? And saying,
Yeah.
"Oh, how can we make this food better?" And it is so integral to our lives, I think often that we
Mm.
forget to think about it. And Peridot Do's farm school sort of slowed my role there. going
Mm,
in, thinking about what does it mean to be part of a food system, and the way that I was in the pilot course, and there was so much that they were still ironing out, but it was beautifully curated. Huge shout out to Lainey. She put together this incredible curriculum with amazing educators and on-farm experiences. And when I had the good fortune of spending 2 weeks working or helping with work on a
mhm.
farm in the San Juans, and that really was my first exposure to farming at all. I've been a city girl through and through, and we talked
Hmm.
about this a little bit in take one. I think
Yeah.
my growing experience was, I don't know, growing a potted plant once every other year and being so excited about the one tomato that I grew. I think going from
And
there to,
well, I think about too, sorry to interrupt, is the
no,
two main brands you worked on CPG wise before that were coffee brands. And so
yeah,
those supply chains are really so disconnected from North America because you're sourcing mainly that coffee from Central and South America, right? So like it's also interesting just to see that contrast, right? For you
yeah,
personally.
that's absolutely true. And when you think about finding food too, even when I was looking for,
Mm,
let's say I went to like a South Asian store, an Indian store to buy groceries and to buy
yeah.
vegetables that I had kind of grown up with,
Mm-hmm.
those
Hmm.
don't grow here either. Those are tropical vegetables that are being,
Mm,
schlepped from halfway across the world.
right.
There are some, this is a little bit of a sidebar, but there's some incredible nurseries here now in North America that grow
Nice.
culturally rooted foods and vegetables. And there are a couple that I know in the Bay Area actually that do incredible work.
Hell yeah.
Shaoshan Farms is one of them. Um, and there's Kula Nursery, I think they're called. So there is efforts being made to integrate where we live with what we can grow and keeping it culturally relevant, which is its own soapbox that I can be on, I think. Um,
Hmm.
but once I went through farm school, I think it became really obvious to me that where my skills would be best used is to connect everyday people, people who are not who are like me or where I was, but don't have the luxury of like taking time off to go through farm school, finding a way
Mm,
for them to connect with our food and our food systems in a much more direct way.
mm,
So you're right, we didn't start out with CPG. I started out with education and experience. And that was
mm,
both online and in person. But the thing that we
mm,
kept hearing over and over again, and the thing that I kept hearing over and over again is this is great, but what does this mean when I go back up to my kitchen or when I go down to my kitchen and have to cook
right.
something for myself?
Right.
Aside
Right.
from going into the local farmers market or like shopping at my local co-op, what can I do to support regenerative agriculture? And that became the impetus for me to continue to ask people and have this conversation about how do you make everyday people
Mm-hmm.
um, care about and at least adopt, even if you don't have the bandwidth to care about the
Mm-hmm.
details of where every ingredient on your plate has come from. How do you make it easy for everyday people to make choices that are better for the environment?
Mm,
I think it's a really interesting journey from how to have the biggest potential impact. AC and I obviously talk a lot about the power and the importance of regenerative brands and the ability they have to play this critical role in our food system, where they have this ability to educate and connect people to their farmers, and just like you mentioned, in a way that is convenient for most people's shopping habits, because some of us may not have the time, energy, effort, or accessibility to the farmers market, or
mm-hmm.
to be able to connect directly with our farmers for a variety of different reasons. So I think it's just
Mm-hmm.
really interesting to hear your story and how that brought you to feeling like the highest potential impact you can have is to create your own brand that supports regenerative agriculture. So I just want to comment on that. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
super interesting.
And
Yeah,
that
sorry.
Ash, your brand also, and just it makes me think of the farmers market is the farmers market is the farmers market. And what I mean by that is you might go to one in Missouri and go to one in California, and they're a little different, but like it's the same kind of a deal, right? It's I'm a local farmer, I bring my product here. With Regen brands, we can have a meat brand that like has a heavy Costco business. We can have a totally e-commerce brand that's a pantry staple brand. Like there's more flexibility, which I also think is it increases that accessibility, right? And I think we're a long way away from solving the price and accessibility problem of regenerative food or better food or whatever we want to insert in there. But I do think regen brands, are a lever there. So just that thought was coming to mind as y'all were talking about that.
That your both of your points are so well made, and it's making me think of it's also a little bit about what part of the plate we're looking at. right? It is when you go to a farmer's market, or even for the folks that may not be able to access or afford farmers markets, because you're right, food access is it's a connected but a whole different uh,
Right.
road that we can walk down. But when you look at folks that can access fresh food and can go to farmers markets, that's still only a portion of the plate. So there is still a portion of the plate that we're not talking about. And and that's sort of the area that I became interested in. It's things like grains and legumes and things that you're not likely to always find in your farmers markets, right? Like you're not going to go there and find people growing rice if you live in the Pacific
Right.
Northwest.
Right.
Um, and I think those things become so complex too, because food is complex. One of my favorite things, one of my favorite exercises to do is, this is the teacher in me and the academic in me coming out. But if I showed you an apple right now, I want to put you both on the spot here and say, okay, think about an apple. It's a
Yeah.
red
I had an apple
apple.
for lunch, so I am ready for this exercise. Bring it on.
There
Kyle's a
you
big apple guy.
go.
I'm
Love
not as big of
apples.
an apple guy as Kyle.
Okay, tell me why you're not an apple guy, AC.
Oh man, I grew up in a giant warehouse full of them and every other fruit, and I just love berries. I mean, I'm a berries person. Like it's just really, it's nothing against apples. It's more I just like berries better.
Okay. Kyle, why did you eat an apple for lunch?
One of my favorite snacks is apple with nut butter. Growing up, like apple and peanut butter. Though today it was from Locavore, local shop, an Envy apple varietal with Tim Richards, Philosopher Foods, Stone Ground Crunchy almond butter, which is like
Yeah.
the best
Yum.
snack ever.
Okay, you both are definitely not plants in the audience for for folks looking at this, but those are exactly the answers I could have hoped to get, right? Food is emotional. Both of you talked about how your love or dislike of apples, not dislike, AC, I'm definitely putting
Childhood.
words in your mouth here, is
Wow,
related
that's
to your
interesting.
childhood.
Yeah.
It
Wow.
is. And it's
Wow.
also related to your culture. Like to my daughter, who's now 11, she's up on apples and, nut butters as a snack, or apples and peanut butter as a snack. I can do that. So to me, I have no emotional attachment to an apple. It's not my first go-to snack.
That's
I
super interesting. Wow. That's awesome. Yeah.
It
Wow.
is because food is emotional, and this idea that food should mean the same thing to everyone is it's ridiculous, and every food
Right.
is not going to mean the same thing to everyone. And so I think there
It's
is such a
such a good point.
room.
I need to interrupt just to talk about like the relevancy of the story.
Please.
This is totally fortuitous. Again, not planted. When I worked in Thailand as a dive master, we constantly had people from different cultures, people from France, Germany, Russia, United States, England, all on the boat at the same time. So there's all these different food cultures happening. And I, as the token American, would every day eat an apple with peanut butter. And most of the other cultures were like, "What are you doing? That is a combination I have not seen before. It is super weird." And one of my favorite things to do is to share it with everybody else so they could try and experience a little bit of my culture. So actually, like, exactly to your point, like, why should it be uniform? And one of the most fun things to do is to share, an emotional positive from my childhood with all of these other people that I'm, trying to make friends with.
It's exactly that, right? We are in an increasingly globalized world. The fact that the three of us, with such varied backgrounds and varied sort of upbringing, can have this conversation is points to the fact that we're in a deeply globalized world. So for me, the question that we're trying to answer with Ojaswe, and the question that I think about all the time, is in such a globalized world where we all have such complex identities as people, how do you create culturally relevant food that is still also climate friendly on a deeply, quickly warming planet? And that's such a big question that I don't think any one brand or any one type of food can answer it in a satisfactory way.
Well, I think trying to answer that question in its two parts in any of the singular parts is already such a hard thing to do. So the fact that you're trying to do both at the same time with the cultural relevance piece and the climate awareness piece is like, you're not making this easy for yourself.
Oh God,
This is
no.
a hard project, right? But it's a passion project, and that's why we're all here. Like,
Yeah.
regen is not easy, and I can only imagine like how difficult it must be to try to like answer both of those questions at the same time. And really, like the answer is Ojaswe, right?
I mean, that's the hope, right? It is Ojaswe, it is brands like Ojaswe, because I think the other piece about being regenerative for me is being in a network of supported brands. I think we're
Mm.
the other thing that our world needs is to move away from this model of endless growth and
Mm.
perpetual growth to a model of controlled growth, because we're like coming up on Earth overshot day. Sorry, my tongue's
Mhm.
all twisted. And we're talking about using up every year, we use up the resources that we should be using quicker and
Mhm.
quicker. So we're working on borrowed time here.
Right.
And there is
Mm-hmm.
no one way. I mean, as much as I want to say, yes, Ojaswe is going to be the brand that provides, that answers this question, I certainly hope not. I hope there are other brands out there that are, answering different parts of the same question and that we
Mhm.
can collaborate and work together. And it as an early stage brand, I think I've gotten one of two reactions to it. One of which is, oh, you're just being naive because you
Mm.
have to steal share from someone.
Mm.
Um, and you're not lucrative enough because you're not thinking about an endless cycle of growth, or you're not thinking about 10x growth in like, 2 years. And
Mhm.
those are absolutely valid considerations for the economic model in which we live, but they are also completely unsustainable when we're trying to build a system that doesn't exist in a way that it should today.
Mm.
Sorry if you
Totally.
were
And
bothering you there.
AC, you go ahead. I'm dominating the
Well, I
mic.
was just, you're good. I was just going to say it's a really good segue into what inspired your first product, right? Like, I think that's a perfect, like, that was philosophy and theoretical, right? But like, you're actually doing the work, and you went to a farmer or a farm family, and
Yep.
you got told exactly what they needed help commercializing. And then you basically contextualize that with the cultural relevance. So share that with the audience, because I think it just brings that theory and philosophy to life.
Yeah, I think I have you to thank for this, because back when I was still in my exploratory phase, you introduced me to AXO, which was this company run by a couple of Booth MBA folks, Clara and Isa. Um, and through them, I met the Action family. They live in Saskatchewan. They do an incredible job of regenerative, very nuanced regenerative ag. It was beautiful to talk to the Action family and to learn from both Derek and Tanis, kind of what their struggles had been, what their journey was, and what they were looking to achieve with the stuff that they're growing. And they're not atypical in that, farmers that are putting in all of this blood, sweat, and tears into switching to more regenerative practices, they do want to see their products end up in places that are valued, that are
Mm-hmm.
that are not just
Mm-hmm.
shipped off to the commodity markets and sold to an
Yeah.
unknown end, but more
Mm-hmm.
so there is joy that we talked about this with Derek and Tanis. There's such joy in knowing this is exactly where your product is, or your grain or
Yeah.
legume or whatever you're growing is ending up.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing that black chickpeas or kala chana is one of the things that they were trying to move. There's not a huge market for black chickpeas in North America, but black
Mm-hmm.
chickpeas,
I didn't even know there was multiple kinds
so,
of chickpeas. So we
uh,
said that yesterday, and I'll say that again
True.
today, because I
True.
think
yep,
most people just know about like regular chickpeas, garbanzo beans, right?
yep, that's exactly right. It's because it's not black chickpeas are not like new to the world. There is a
Mm.
varietal of them that grows or that comes from Italy, from the south of Italy,
Hmm.
and we grow it in Montana. I say we, North
Yeah,
America. There are North American
yeah,
farmers growing it in Montana, and there
yeah.
is a varietal that comes from South Asia, which is Kalachana, which is really a dark brown, really shriveled up looking, kind of ugly looking little legume. And next to a garbanzo, we talked about this a little bit too. Next to a garbanzo, it just doesn't look like you should even be eating that thing.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, but it is so deeply nutritious, and there is cultures all over the world that have cooked with these ingredients that have sort of disappeared from urban tables, right? Like there
Mm.
are varietals of rice and varietals of grains even that just don't exist anymore because we've emphasized scale over everything else right now. And talking to them, and the light bulb just sort of, I got lucky. I mean, if they had said, there are a couple of other ingredients that they do grow that I did not have familiarity with, but here was one that I had recognized from my grandmom's kitchen that I knew what to do with, or at least
Wow.
had a hypothesis on what to do with.
Yeah.
And it was growing right here in my backyard. Like, why would I not take advantage of that? And they were also super
Right.
willing to take that bet with with a small nobody that showed up and said, will you sell me 1,000 pounds of this so I can
Yeah.
experiment with it?
Yeah.
And I think that was a crucial moment for me of meeting that farmer and having an ingredient, and being able to take it from there to the next step and to bringing it to market.
So I want to kind of like summarize a little bit. So as you decided, like, hey, I want to start a CPG brand, you went out to talk to regenerative farmers to say, like, where can I source something that is regenerative that sort of feels familiar and authentic to me? And then once you found that, you sort of built the brand and the product around that specific ingredient and supply chain. Is that correct?
That feels very neatly bottled up. It certainly wasn't that neat. It wasn't. It was such a
Yeah.
messy process, Kyle. It was such a messy process because I didn't even when I went with Isa to visit the Axons, it was less about, oh, I want to start a CPG brand. I think even then I was like, oh,
Mm,
CPG, like, am I really going back to
Yeah.
CPG? Because
Yeah.
it kind of is. Unfortunately, there are days where I wake up and I wish I had never worked in CPG because so much of you don't know what you don't know, right? And you have so much enthusiasm for it.
mm-hmm.
But there are days where I wake up in sweats because I know exactly what I'm up against in trying to do this. Um,
Right.
I think for me, the process was a lot messier. It was much more what ingredients are available and how can we bring them to consumers? And then the more I started to talk to consumers, people were like, "Well, what am I going to do with brown chickpeas? Sure, I'll take them from
Yeah.
you for a gift, but I don't have the time to be Googling a brown chickpeas recipe every day. Like, I have other shit to do."
Right.
And it was, I think, a combination of both of those as it evolved, which led me to, okay, here is a thing I know how to do, much like your Apple story, that I want to share with other people. I know how to eat apple with
Mm-hmm.
nut butters, and I'm going to share with other people who and share my culture and share a piece of this amazing snack which everyone should have. And that's kind of how the Base and Sheila mix was born.
And
Gotcha.
for the uneducated, not CPG heavy person like the three people on this call, that's the complete opposite of what's normal, right? What's normal is you do a bunch of category analysis, you figure out what the gaps or the white space in the category is, or you figure out what's working and you slap your brand on it. Whatever. What you're doing is the opposite, and you're saying, let's go to the farmer, let's center the farmer, let's center the environmental outcome, right? And if we bring Deloitte or McKinsey or one of them into this conversation, they're going to say, well, that's not what you should do, right? And while that may be true from a conventional business perspective, like, we're not going to solve the problems that we have by doing it that way. And so while it's the harder road, I just think we at least need to acknowledge it and commend you for it because once again, we're not going to solve the problems that we have unless we approach it that way.
Yeah, I think so many of the brands that you've had on the podcast have said some version of this, right? There is the work of paving this road is being done right now by small brands. The work of saying, hey, we want our supply chain to dictate what goes out into the market is being done by these smaller, more emerging brands. And
Mm-hmm.
even the brands that I look up to. So we use Diaspora Co. spices in our mixes. And Diaspora is such an incredible brand that I look up to because they started with a similar question, right? And because of the authenticity that they embody in saying, hey, how do you decolonize supply chains? How do you, specifically around the spice industry, how do you bring fresh spices to people in the world while ensuring farmers get equitably paid? It's those difficult questions. I think it's a double-edged sword. CPG, smaller emerging brands in CPG are better positioned to answer it because, most of us are just trying to do things because they're the right way to do things. In a
Yeah.
larger stakeholder driven public company, that's a much more complex situation because your incentives are misaligned there. Your incentives are not aligned to how do I create a restorative supply chain? And it would require
Right.
changing supply chains that were hundreds of years old right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Um, Yeah,
There's a few
I think
questions I want to ask you. There's actually like
yeah.
1,200 questions I want to ask you. There's like a million. This
I don't
conversation,
have the
there's so
time
many
for
different
that.
like
Shocking
spider
to hear
webs.
from Kyle. Shocking.
There's a lot of directions we can go here. But for the sake of trying to stay on point with the podcast and to make sure that the listeners really understand the benefit of Ojaswe products for both themselves and for the environment, give us kind of a comparative view of like how is a conventional chickpea grown and how are these regenerative chickpeas grown, and why does that matter from both a human health perspective and an environmental perspective?
Yeah.
Good question.
Oh, this is a great question. I'm gonna try to keep it again as concise as I can, and feel free to jump in, both of you, because you both have aspects of depth of knowledge in this area
Yeah.
that I certainly don't. I The big difference for Ojaswe products, and I'll get to the regenerative piece here in a second. The big difference is we're thinking about end to end. So we're thinking not just about where is this chickpea coming from, how is it grown? We're also thinking about how is this being packaged and what is Kyle going to do after he uses this bag? Is it just going to go to the landfill, or can he throw it in, a compost pile? Our bags are compostable. It drives up our costs significantly. And this is a conversation I have with fellow food businesses in Seattle, not necessarily CPG. Compostables are nearly 10 times the cost of petroleum-based plastics, and it's wild to make that
That's
choice.
nuts.
On the other end, regenerative farmers are making that same exact choice. I think the investment that goes into whether that's sweat equity or those first 4 to 7 years of transition, the investment that goes into converting land that has been heavily tilled or heavily put through an industrial system of agriculture, it's intense. It's monetarily intense. It is education and knowledge wise intense. And the big thing, the big difference on the regenerative side is these farmers that grow chickpeas for me are taking care to use practices that are good for the soil. It is soil centered. It's the health of the soil. We call ourselves a regenerative food company that's rooted in cultural fusion. And this is the regenerative piece of it. It is being focused on the earth quite literally, whether that's using minimal till or using or not using, not taking a spray and pray approach, and making sure and are taking care of your soil microbiome, making sure you're co-planting and you're thinking about your rotation of crops. And chickpeas by themselves legumes in general are incredible because they affix nitrogen in the soil. And what that means is they are restoring the soil microbiome in a way that helps farmers minimize the use of synthetic nitrogen or chemical fertilizers on their soil.
Right.
I love that the accents say they are loyal to the soil, and I think it definitely shows in the quality of
Love
product
that.
that you get from them. Right? It's
Yeah.
just beautiful. It's so fresh. It is so incredibly flavorful. And at the end of the day, Ojaswe's pancake mix is chickpea flour with two different types of chickpeas and spices. So if you wanted to go buy store-bought chickpea flour, you could technically do that. But we've had consumers say they can taste the difference, that they can actually, we've had people come back and say, yep, we will buy from you because we know you're supporting this incredible farm work, but also we can't truly recreate this at home in a way that's quite so, and that feels so nutritious and healthy and clean and flavorful. Long-winded answer, Kyle.
One thing you didn't mention, Ash, that I know a little bit about the accents, and this is, I think a lot of times people like us that are in the space overlook this to note it, which is just like crop rotations. Very basic, but you can educate me if you know more specifics. But I know that the accents have a very intense crop rotation, and that is one of the biggest issues in our grain economy, right? And in our grain agronomy is most people are just planting corn, soy, wheat over and over and over and over again. So if you just have a crop rotation, right, it's going to boost biodiversity. It's going to boost soil organic matter. It's going to bring different nutrients into the soil, like the nitrogen that you just mentioned with the legumes. And so what the commercial context is for that, though, is that then we have to find markets for all those products, right? So why do those farmers grow the same commodity over and over and over again? Because they can harvest it, they can send it to the sale barn or the commodity, to the elevator, if it's grains, right? And they don't need to think about it. they might need different equipment for a different crop. They need a different market for a different crop. They need a different seed. They need a different level of expertise. And so I want to just make sure, I think a lot of our audience knows that, but just to one, draw attention to it, two, salute the farmers and just show like how big of a difference that makes. And three, like to me, and I want to be careful to check my privilege of like not ever being a farmer, but like that seems like low-hanging fruit that we can get a lot of these grain farmers to do. Is just like, can you just get a crop rotation? Like, can you just get a basic rotation rolling? Because I think that like the investment or the switching cost there versus like the ROI is like pretty compelling.
Man, I was just at the Casad Family Farms, and Kate was talking about some government incentive. I can't remember if it was national or just the state of Oregon, but they were offering $125 per acre to plant a cover crop, to have a rotation. And that barely covers the cost of actual implementation, but the farmers adopted it wholeheartedly. Like they didn't need a ton of push to like start to make these transitions. So Anthony, to your point, like there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, or in this case, low-hanging beans, because we're talking legumes. Great joke. I'm just going to call that out. But anyways, like these incentives can work, and there's proof that like it can happen, and there seems to be buy-in from the farmers who understand that these changes are beneficial for them long term. And at least in talking to people like Kate and people like Ash who have these connections to the farmers, like it feels like they want to do the right thing. And if we can just make it that much easier for them to start the conversion, like there's a whole world of opportunity out there where we can make improvements for the land, for people, for flavor, in every capacity that matters.
Yeah, I wouldn't pretend to be a farmer. There's a reason that after working for 2 weeks on the farm, I knew that was not one. I'm not cut out for it. It's incredibly intense work, and two, that's not a good use of my skill set. But I do know that just from talking to the handful of farmers that I've had the privilege of talking to, there is so much heart in the work that regenerative farmers are doing today. And there's so much, and for them too, it's an uphill battle. I certainly don't know the nuances of incentive and cost versus adoption, but I do agree with you. In the part that I can speak to is that markets are a huge portion of this. Creating a market for this is a huge portion of it. Creating a market is not just, making sure that millets are accessible to buy. That's a portion of it, because yes, a huge portion of folks do want to cook with ingredients. There's a big part of our foodie consumer base would love to try out new flavors and ingredients. But at the same time, a huge portion of consumers just don't have the time or the bandwidth for it. And our lives are broader structurally within the consumer markets. Our lives are not set up to be to allow for that sort of high touch adaptation of things. And that's, I think, where packaged food brands can come in and sort of make a difference and change the way we're thinking about things.
Absolutely. And I want to bring it back to the brand thing, the brand side here, and focus a little bit about how, you mentioned before how you can't believe you're back in CPG. It's such an uphill battle. Sometimes you wake up with this way, like, how and why am I doing this? And I want to acknowledge the fact that you came from big CPG, working for Starbucks and Nestle, who, I would assume you had all of the resources you could possibly imagine. Right. From a data perspective, from a marketing perspective, from your category management background, and to go from having... Like if I think about a sports team playing football, like you had an all-star crew, and now it's like you're just the quarterback with one lineman trying to like score a touchdown, and it feels impossible against a full defense, right? So
yes,
like how do you navigate that now, coming from like you've really walked into this with both eyes open, whereas a lot of people who are in your position haven't played in the CPG space before. You know what the other team has. How do you reconcile that?
Aside from just
and how has it changed your strategy in like moving forward? Like, where do you see this, taking your brand?
Oh God. What I was going to say, Kyle, is I'm just going to take that ball and go home, and nobody else can play. That's it. But I'm going home. Only my family gets to see this. No, but kidding aside, I think spot on, right? I think not only are large CPG companies well resourced, they have an incredible pool of talent. I've worked with some incredible people in that specialize in the things they do. And I think the thing that um, happens when you decide to start your own like, business or brand or whatever is you're kind of wearing all those hats. And I certainly don't have there are portions of this that I'm figuring out as I go. But I think the big difference
Of
for me
course.
coming from a category and brand background was the lack of data. I think the thing that I missed the most was
Mm-hmm.
being able to like go pull a report from like a Nielsen and say, oh, category white space, this is where we should
Yeah.
launch. And in the absence of that, I think you do what you can. And for us, it's been very scrappy. I had an intern a couple summers ago, and she and I just sat down and sent out all of these packages to friends of friends. And had actual Zoom interviews and asked about taste and texture and where would you use this and what does this remind you of? And it helped inform, I think, both the formulation of the product, but also how we are talking to people about it. I'm small
Mm.
enough now, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday. I'm one of the earliest, Ojaswe is one of the earliest stage brands that's been on the podcast, and I thank you for
Yeah.
this platform. Um, we're still small enough that we do farmers markets, and that's a great way for me to
Yeah.
meet people who care and understand and want to know the story of it and
Yeah.
want to hear this and for me to understand what they think of the product, right? Because we always sample. Our conversions are incredible when we sample. We've sold out 3 times and I've had to like schlep all my stuff back to the commissary kitchen to make stuff.
Mm.
um but I think what you get from it is teaching people, and it may not be data in aggregate, but it is data in the
Mm-hmm.
particular. It is very qualitative feedback. And what
Mm.
I want to now go test, and this is where I think oh, funding would help, funding for CPG brands would help,
Mm.
um, is it allows us to take this little hypothesis that we tested and try to put it out to a broader audience and say, okay, does this work at scale? Because the scale piece and acceleration piece is what is so highly capital intensive.
Mm.
Right.
Mm. It's a good segue into. I want to give you as unprompted of a setup here as possible.
Oh,
Um,
yeah,
you are a queer BIPOC bootstrap founder, right? Which is a very different
yeah.
experience than a lot of people have. We could talk about how that affects sales and marketing. We could talk about how that affects fundraising, how that affects all kinds of things. But I really just want to turn the mic over to you, Ash, and to say, how has that experience been, and how has it been in the regenerative space? Because I think Kyle and I certainly understand like a lack of biodiversity in terms of humans and in terms of plants and animals is been a big reason why we are having the problems that we have now, and like we need to fix that. So would love to just hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I think it is, gosh, where do I even start? There's a bit
Yeah,
of a soapbox, Stacey. I think
let it rip.
um, being a queer immigrant, BIPOC parent, founder, I'm definitely checking all those boxes
Yeah.
on a form. I'm like, yes, this and this and this and this.
Right.
I think it can feel overwhelming at times, right? Because it's
Hmm.
kind of like OGC is kind of sort of my baby, and at some point I'm going to let it walk on its own. But it feels very much like the feedback we get around OGC once in a while, which is, oh, you're not Indian enough or South Asian enough, like you're not playing up
Interesting.
authenticity in that way. Or you're
Interesting.
not CPG enough. Like, why are you
Mm.
using compostable packaging when you could be,
Mm.
you could reduce your cost to a 10
Right.
of what they are right now. And it feels a little bit like that to occupy all of these different identities. I mean, I certainly have had my share of privilege in that I'm in the top 1% of the world, honestly. I live in the United States. I've had the privilege of having an incredibly valuable education. I
Hmm.
live in a time and space where I can openly say, hey, this is my wife and this is my child, and not fear for
Hmm.
our safety.
Hmm.
And that's still not true in several parts of our country and the world.
Right.
Um, for me, the biggest way in which it has informed me, and the thing that I keep going back to often, is it makes me really aware of all of the people that came before me I had to lay the foundation down for me to be able to be in this place. And for all of the people that are doing the work even today, and for all of the people that will continue to do the work. And that is, I don't know, it kind of is what our role is now, right? We our parents and their parents, well, maybe not literally your parents, because for queer people, that's a complicated issue in its own right. But
Right.
folks that came before us paved the way for it, fought the fight. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and then it's our turn to continue to, shoulder that responsibility for future generations. Because I certainly I don't want my 11-year-old to not have a planet where she doesn't know what fresh food is, or to have a planet that's so devastatingly affected by climate change. It is. So I went back to India. You know this, Stacey. I went back to India for a good decade, more than a decade recently. And I was in a couple of cities that I grew up in, and they had the most intense flooding and monsoons that I have ever seen. I don't remember seeing anything like it. Monsoon season is a whole thing in India, but this was devastating. And we heard about rice exports from India being shut down except for basmati. It's triggered like all of these memes, honestly, on Instagram right now about Costco selling out of rice. And it's wild, right? It's funny, but it's also so stressful because you want to. Sometimes being in this intersection identity makes me feel like I'm seeing things that other people may not be, and it's frustrating, but it's also it's an opportunity for me to look through it and say, okay, maybe this is a thing that I can work on, and this can be food systems can be what I do with the remainder of my days on this planet.
I think it's really amazing to hear your perspective and the fact that you acknowledge like the fact that I think the way you said it was we're standing on the shoulders of giants and all the work that has been done to allow you to live the life that you want to live, and the fact that you want to be one of those giants to help the next generation in a different capacity and to continue obviously the work that has been done previous, but to try to solve these food system problems that really go beyond the food system. I mean, it goes into like, food deserts, cultural. I can't even really articulate what I'm trying to say very well right now, but it's this system that we talked about. Like we talk about how Deloitte or some big consulting groups might not view what you're doing as potentially lucrative because the whole system needs to change. Even the economic system needs to change. Like capitalism for capitalism's sake, eventually we will run out of things to sell if we continue to just consume mindlessly forever. So it really does feel like it's a monumental task of like work that we have to do. And the food system feels like a really tangible way where we can start to make those changes. And I've talked about this before on previous episodes, but what I love about the fact that you saw food as an opportunity to impact climate is the fact that we all make food decisions every day. We might be able to purchase an electric car once a year or once every 5-10 years you make that purchase decision. But food, I mean, you're consuming 3, 5, 10, 12 things a day. And every single one of those things is an opportunity to make a different choice and a potentially beneficial choice. So as somebody who works in food and feels similarly, I really just align with your mentality of like, this is an opportunity for us and we should be paving the way for future generations.
And hopefully those choices are communal. So not only is it an individual opportunity, but we hope that you're sharing those meals, even if it's just one meal a day with other people and other humans, which, Courtney from Akua just said it on the last episode, which is like the dinner table is the best piece of connective technology that's ever been built. And it's like, that's so true. Right. And, for me, it's kind of like a cynical approach of like, if we can't solve these problems in food, I don't have hopes that we can solve them anywhere else because of that.
Yeah, that's a hell of a lot of pressure to put on yourself and the food system. But
I'm very good at being a perfectionistic overachiever that puts too much pressure on myself.
Oh my God,
you should know that by now.
You're right. Why am I surprised? There's so much there though. Food has such a power to bring people together, and we're seeing such vast amounts of, polarization and the inability to have conversations, even when you don't, especially when we don't agree with each other. I think food has the opportunity to help everyone slow down and be mindful. Kyle, you're right.
Mm,
Like, I think I've used that exact analogy before, which is to say, you can't go out and buy a car. I can't go out and buy a car. I can't go out and buy a house.
mm,
But I can make a decision on, even if it's just one decision about one piece
Mm-hmm.
about of one meal, of one snack, of one teeny tiny thing
right.
on my plate. It makes such a huge impact. And I think the other thing that I sometimes worry about when it comes to food and food systems, right, is even within the world of food, there is this sort of judgment that we fall into of each other, of, oh, this food way that you are practicing is incorrect, correct, better
Mm,
than the most
mm,
perfect way of doing things. And that is such a, to me, such a
mhm,
harmful way to do anything, let alone food. It just
mm,
destroys the idea that we can all be slightly imperfect. We don't need everyone to be a perfect environmentalist. What we do need is all of us to be making imperfect choices that are
mhm,
better for the planet in little ways. And I think is food is such an easy way to get there.
mm,
I think that's beautifully said, and I know AC and I are just sitting there nodding our heads because I mean you're very much speaking our language,
mm,
and it makes me want to ask, like, how do you feel about, as a young CPG founder, young brand founder, the regenerative certification landscape today? And I'm curious, from
mm.
like a
Oh
bootstrap
God.
startup, with the philosophy you just mentioned and like the cost of certification, like walk me through how you navigate that as a small, bootstrapped brand.
With great conflict. Um,
Mm,
I think for me, it is, I recognize the value, having come from, my background in understanding people and consumers, right? And having worked on brands, having worked in brand roles, um, I understand the value of certification. It's a simple way in a sea of choice to signal something really quickly. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it has a positive signaling effect. At the same time, certifications are kind of limiting and kind of, specifically for the farmers that I work with and the folks that I don't directly work with that are farmers, can be a limiting way for them to respond to what their soil needs.
mm,
Um,
Mm.
and boxes them into a specific criteria, specific set of criteria. So I think at some level, I do have a slight allergy to certifications. And I also acknowledge that on the consumer side of things, there's value in signaling, for instance, that this is gluten free. Because if someone is
mhm,
uh, like chickpeas are naturally a gluten-free grain, but we process them in a shared facility, which means every batch we make, we have to get tested and make sure that it is celiac friendly. And the only reason we
wow.
started doing that is because we got questions about, hey, is this celiac friendly? Um,
Mhm,
so I recognize the power that it can have in those decision-making frameworks for consumers. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not Yeah, I don't know. We're not pursuing regenerative certification right now. One, yes, it is expensive, but two, it's also not how I want farmers to be thinking about the soil. Like I love that the farmers that we have, traceability and having those personal relationships is incredibly important to me. And much like I
mhm,
don't want someone standing over my shoulder and saying, is that the right color for your brand? Is that the right shape for
mm,
your logo? I
mm,
also don't want to
Right.
be standing over my farmer's shoulder and going, is that the right thing for your soil? I don't know.
mm.
I trust that my farmers are
Yeah.
going to do the job that they are doing, and we will do the job that we are doing. And I think this is where, I think Hoda said this, right? She talked about on a previous episode of
Mhm,
relational, how, and I'm paraphrasing here, but how
mhm.
important relational structures are so
Yep.
that people can take care of the people that don't have, and so that we can support each other in the system. So I think I'm of the school of thought that yes, if a certification is what floats your boat, go for it, get it done. That's awesome. It's a great way to standardize measurement, but standardized measurement does let a bunch of nuance fall through the cracks, and I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with it for the brand that I'm building.
Well, to to also just add like a peek behind the curtain is one, my not that anyone asked for my opinion, but my opinion would be that the ROI for your brand specifically is not past the threshold of it being worthwhile, no matter what certification it would be. And two, the Axtons are not certified organic, and that is the big grain debate, right? Is all the non-organic grain people think they're more regenerative because they don't till, and all the organic people think they're more regenerative because they don't spray. And I don't have an opinion either way. I've heard compelling arguments from each side, but you know, we are due for a reckoning, and I do think that, not to be completely cynical, but there's a ticking time bomb in terms of regenerative certification and integrity of regenerative claims, because right now we live in a world where regenerative claims have proliferated and regenerative integrity has not moved at all, right? And if those things don't scale together, right, if the verification doesn't match the claims in some sort of way, we will be the next natural. And you know, for us personally, we'll have wasted a lot of personal time, but for the world, you know, we'll have lost a great opportunity, which is the bigger issue. So, you know, Kyle and I have a theory of change on that, which we've talked about on other episodes and with other people. But, you know, it's a real problem. And I guess I'll just round it out with, none of the certifications are going to win, right? We are not going to end up in a scenario where one of the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, however many you want to count at this point, are going to just be the winner, and that's going to be the end all be all, right? And that is the strategy right now. That's the strategy being employed individually, and the strategy being employed collectively, because there's no other strategy, and it's a major problem.
I want to expand on that a little bit, AC. And again, nobody asked for my opinion either. But I think it's important to.
But that's why we host a podcast, because we get to just have opinions,
right? I think it's important for the non-CPG listener to understand why there's not going to be one winner, why it's different than non-GMO, why it's different than organic, and why it's different than gluten-free. You know, those are binary things. And regenerative is so context-based. There's so many variables in play. You know, growing chickpeas in Canada might require different practices than growing chickpeas in the south of the US or in India or wherever else. So when you try to standardize a particular set of practices over something that can change based on elevation, based on rainfall, based on soil type, and all of these other things, it is doomed. It will always fail. And we actually need to embrace the fact that we have these competing certifying agencies, because they can all have their specialization in certain places, in certain crop types, in land-based versus sea-based versus animals versus plants. Like, we need to honor all of that work and find a way for us to work together to succeed, to allow what Ash said perfectly before, allow for the nuance of food to be communicated. Because if we can't do that, and we continue to operate in this, again, efficiency, profit-minded sense where everything has to be uniform, we are doomed to fail.
And binary.
You know, this is making me think of 3 different things. I'm just going to assume you asked for my opinion here, y'all.
Ash, what's your opinion?
Yeah. It was implied.
One is, when you think about who is at the table making these certifications, and if we don't source from, Ojaswe doesn't source from South Asia today, except for the spices, and they come through diaspora. It's definite, having grown up in a culture where, being colonized, being a colony of Great Britain is a very real part of the culture. There is a reason that so many folks today in India are so fluent in English. That's only the smallest thing of the surface to scratch. But when you think about smallholder farms in other parts of the world that have, or indigenous farms that have for millennia used these practices that are earth specific to their soil systems, as you pointed out, Kyle. It certainly rubs me the wrong way to say, oh, wait a minute, we are here going to make all these standards that you have to not only follow, but pay for in order to get certified. And that's just a disproportional way to, the privilege in that is so not distributed equitably. That just seems to me like an absurd ask, to ask someone whose culture has for millennia followed these practices to pay so that they can get a mark that shows that they have followed these practices. That's just a backwards way of looking at it to me. The second piece is about nuance. I've heard Julia Collins, who runs Plan Forward, say that she sees the nuance of the lack of certification as a positive thing. And I think it is because I'm definitely paraphrasing what I've read here, but it is for these reasons. It is because there is so much difference between what's right for my soil. Heck, there's so much difference between what's right for one little soil bed in one patch of my backyard versus the soil bed right next to it. It's because those two soils are going to be so different, even in that little microclimate. And the third piece is communicating this nuance to consumers is always going to be hard, because the thing that you will hear over and over again is when a consumer is looking at a shelf and making their decisions about, let's say, eggs, for instance, there are so many different certifications on those eggs. It's impossible to expect one consumer to know exactly what the difference between one and the other is. So I do worry that we are shooting ourselves in the foot for with all of with expecting consumers to understand all of these nuances when practitioners themselves cannot agree on them. And I, Anthony, much like you, I do worry that this is going to make regenerative the next natural, but it doesn't have to be. I think there's a great deal of I have a great deal of optimism that nuance can be a good thing, and that we can hold nuance and expect more from people in our collective systems.
And to continue paraphrasing, but I was there when Julia said that quote, and she not only said it was a positive, she said it was our greatest strength, or our greatest, it was like a resounding positive. But we could talk about that for a long time. Ash, I want to bring us home with the final question that we ask everybody, which that segues really well into, which is, how do we get ReGen brands at 50% market share by 2050?
Gosh, I've been thinking about this since you asked me it. 2050 feels both like a very long time away and like right around the corner, right? I think there are a few things that I can think of. I think at least for the near term, I see emerging brands as being the sort of tip of the spear when it comes to I have problems with aggressive analogies like tip of the spear, but emerging brands are doing the work of rethinking our food supply systems. Finding a way to resource those brands, whether that's from retailers creating shelf sets, and sort of, it's been said before on this podcast too by other brands, retailers have the power to influence decision making for shoppers that are walking into the store. So getting retailer support for these emerging brands that are doing food equitable, amazing, time-friendly food systems work, that's one way that's absolutely got to be done. Resourcing emerging brands with even larger CPG, right? Because there is all of this. One of the things that I struggle with is this notion that every brand, even every emerging brand that's working on CPG, is trying to like do the same things, but do it in their own little silos, in their own little ways. If there is a way to share those lessons and learnings and resources across the board, like if there was, I don't know, if we were all one massive connected creature, like the power of that is so incredible. I don't have a theory. I don't have a concrete answer. I have theories on how to make it happen, but I'd love to see a world where that becomes the model of growth versus, oh, I'm going to guard my little product here and you can guard your little product there and we will fight for the same consumer. Why are we doing that? That's not a sustainable way to grow. And finally, I think finding incentives that enable consumers, I think, to make that choice, right? For us, we know that it's health, it's taste, and it's convenience. Those are the reasons people are buying Ojaswe's pancake mixes. They love the taste. They are choosing it for health. Our ingredients are incredible, and taste. And being able to make it really quickly, just add water. Anyone can do that. Children can.
Myself included, and I'm not a pro cook.
You're fine.
I want to take that as an opportunity to reiterate where people can find Ojaswe. It's ojaswe.com. I will certainly be picking some up because I've only had savory pancakes once before, and that was at a cafe in Auckland, New Zealand, and it was absolutely mind-blowing. So I will absolutely be buying some and looking forward to it.
You need to tag that cafe in your show notes.
Yeah. I do. I think it's called something bird. I'll find it. We'll figure it out. But Ash, thank you so much for the time. Truly enjoyed the conversation. I feel like we kind of weaved way off our usual path here, but I think it was for the best. It just felt like a really great natural conversation. So yeah, thank you so much for the time, for doing this.
Thank you both.
Essentially 1.5, almost 2 times now.
Yeah.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me 1.5, 2 times.
Thanks, Ash. Appreciate you.
For show notes, episode transcripts, and more information on our guests and what we discuss on the show, check out our website, regen-brands.com. That is regen-brands.com. You can also find our ReGen recaps on the website. ReGen recaps take less than 5 minutes to read and cover all the key points of the full hour-long conversations. You can check out our YouTube channel, ReGen Brands Podcast, for all of our episodes with both video and audio. The best way to support our work is to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to future episodes, and share the show with your friends. Thanks for tuning in to the ReGen Brands Podcast, brought to you by the ReGen Coalition and Outlaw Ventures. We hope you learned something new in this episode, and it empowers you to use your voice, your time, and your dollars to help us build a better and more regenerative food system. Love you guys.